solid evidence about the changing climate going back to the 1960s. And we've had more or less confidence, and actually growing confidence, about the seriousness and the threat it poses to humankind over the years, to the point today where it is now quite rightly declared as an emergency. And one of the reasons why it is such an emergency is for the last 50 or 60 years that we've known about this, we've not really done much to combat it. Various commitments made internationally and nationally, but still emissions have been going up to the point today where we really do need an emergency programme. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is advising the world that if we wish to have any reasonable chance of staying inside the envelope of 1.5 degrees of warming this century, then we need to be cutting emissions in half per decade starting right now. So we're making a 50% cut by 2030, another 50% by 2040, and so on, to get down to net zero very quickly indeed. And this is obviously a huge challenge, but in an emergency, the stops are pulled out and people take action to do what's necessary. And in the case of this, the implications of not rising to the challenge really are very profound. In terms of not only extreme weather, but also threats to food and water security, and also potentially the very biggest driver of all, to the mass extinction of wildlife species, which is now gathering pace on this planet as well. So there are a very wide range of very big reasons why we should act. And for quite a long time, many people have said, well, economically, this would be ruinous. We would spend too much money. This would harm prospects for development and ending poverty. But of course, the absolute opposite is actually the case. And if we don't do what's needed, then the consequences of that will be far more costly and far more damaging to the prospects of poor people globally. So this is an agenda that needs to be grasped firmly with both hands now, and from the level of localities and communities right through to the global stage. I began my interests in the environmental field at a very early age, and like many people of my generation, became very interested in wildlife, and then that takes you into a career in conservation, which is where I began. But you very soon realise that, you know, saving particular bits of land and individual species really is not enough. We've got to grapple with these far bigger systemic issues. And it was really in the middle to late 1980s that I began to learn about the threats posed by climate change, and quickly became aware that one of the things that I was working on back then, namely deforestation, actually was a very big part of the challenge that's in front of us. And so my work in the field of biodiversity conservation and campaigning for the interests of Indigenous people from quite an early stage, and certainly in my career at Friends of the Earth that began in 1990, was very much bound up with the same carbon issues. If you do want to conserve the biodiversity of the rainforests and the Indigenous people's cultures, never mind the water services, then all of that is inextricably linked with what we have to do to cut carbon dioxide emissions. And so this came centre stage to me many, many years ago, working more on what you might regard as the wildlife issues. But I soon became very much convinced that this was one of the top questions we had to deal with, and later on became involved in campaigns on transport and energy policy. And probably one of the most important things I did was, during my time as director at Friends of the Earth, was to adopt a campaign for a Climate Change Act, which became law in 2008, and actually was a world leading moment when this country was the first to adopt a national legally binding framework to cut emissions over a period of decades. And obviously that process continues to this day. But, you know, we're very, very far from having all of the solutions to this. And, you know, the issues have not gone away. And in many cases, they've actually grown as economic development has continued apace across the globe. And as other countries have sought to catch up with the kind of economic development of Western countries, so the issue has spread and become more profound. But I think, you know, the awareness that's there now, and the extent to which we can actually see solutions, which are no longer really theoretical, they're actually real. And I saw an amazing graph this week showing how the European Union has now succeeded in having more of its electricity coming from renewables than now comes from coal. And I remember 20 years ago in bitter arguments with vocal critics who said renewables will never work, they're too expensive, the technology is not proven, it will be a threat to energy security, and really is not a realistic prospect. But now we can see that those solutions are realistic because they're actually working in some parts of the world. So getting scale behind all of that, plus a massive program of forest recovery and ecosystem restoration, plus sustainable agriculture. We can see models of all of this scattered around the world. We now have to put them together and turn them into the mainstream to make those things normal rather than exceptional. Everything I've been doing for the last 35 years has been in the field of sustainability, and I've been very fortunate to have a very wide-ranging set of opportunities to join in with all of this. And I began my work with the Wildlife Trust, working on local conservation education back in the 1980s, early 1980s, and then was working with BirdLife International on rare species of parrots living in the tropical rainforests, which then took me into campaigning on the tropical rainforests with Friends of the Earth, and then moving from there some 18 years later into a period of working with the University of Cambridge, helping His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales on some of his projects, advising some major companies and writing many books in the process, and then spending a period at WWF, and now back into a new role with Natural England, being the chair of the government's Nature Conservation Agency. And I have to say, one of the big things that's right at the core of what we're trying to do is to bring these issues of nature recovery and climate change mitigation and adaptation very close together, very much closer together, this idea of nature-based solutions. So conserving peatlands, restoring forests, locking up carbon in agricultural soils, restoring and repairing coastal ecosystems like salt marshes and seagrass beds, which help to catch carbon too. The agenda is very much coming together, and I'm delighted to still be a part of all of that. But it's wonderful to see so many more people now working in this field, because it has expanded. The non-governmental organisations are far bigger. Government is taking the issues more seriously. Many major companies now have sustainability teams in place. And so this is something that still is gathering momentum. And I'm very pleased to still be able to contribute something to it all. I think the one thing that well, I've learned quite a few things, I guess, over the years, but one thing that I think is really important in all of these environmental discussions is optimism, because if you look at the science and the data that we have to hand, it's very easy to paint a very gloomy picture, and that is, it's reasonable. You could look at the data through one set of eyes and say, actually, this is impossible. There's too many people. The economic development has got so much momentum. There is a level of apathy which is blocking progress, and you could say all of that, and you may have a good point. But actually, if we focus on that side of it, I think we do away with our only chance of succeeding, which is coming from this growing awareness, the rise of new technologies, new policies and laws coming, and we maximize the opportunities of success by giving people hope, I think. And this is quite a difficult balance to achieve, because on the one hand, there is a sense of urgency that is required, and there is a sense of peril that must be understood. But at the same time, if you leave it at that, without painting the picture of what's possible and how that would be good for people and good for the economy, then I fear we abandon our last chance to be able to fix this. And then the other side of the optimism piece is inclusivity, and being able to come with an agenda that brings people in. And certainly for much of my career, the berating of the fossil fuel industries and countries and administrations that wouldn't see what was needed was very much a necessary part, and remains a necessary part actually of what we have to do to apply pressure. But at the same time, we have to make it inclusive and to give people opportunities for them to see that they have a role in it, whether they're a major corporation or a political party that at one time in its history might have had skepticism about all of this. And so that I guess would be my message. Aim for inclusivity and optimism, as well as telling the story of peril and doom that is a real one.